Thank you very much. I thought I'd just say a little bit about, start by just talking about Refugee Week, because this is Refugee Week. Refugee Week's our annual celebration of what refugees bring to the UK, and I think it's also a celebration of the welcome that the UK provides to refugees, where that welcome is provided unambiguously and open-heartedly. And there is activity around the country, literally hundreds of events taking place. I've got my bag over there. I'm heading off after this up north to Blackburn, where I'm speaking at an event this evening. I've got events tomorrow, and I speak in Newcastle at another event on Saturday, and I'm back on London for another event on Sunday afternoon. And it's wonderful. What I see around the country is communities, organisations coming together to say there is a different way of doing this. We do not think the UK does what it should do to exercise in the exercise of its legal and its moral obligations, and we could and we should be doing more. So it's a celebration through music, through art, drama, poetry, food, and we've got a great story to tell. How refugees over many years have enriched our culture, have enriched our communities, have enriched our commerce, have enriched every aspect of British life. Whether we talk about the famous refugees we know, and one of the guys who set up Marks and Spencer's was a refugee. Karl Marx was a refugee. I believe Rita Ora was a refugee. Freddie Mercury was a refugee, and they're just the celebrities, but the hundreds of thousands of refugees that are affected, and I would say improved our lives in the UK and made us an outward-looking international country. That's if we look at the population. What I'm going to talk about today is looking at the UK system for welcoming refugees, for recognising refugees, where the problems are at present, and what the future is looking like, whether or not we stay in the European Union. And the European Union, I'm not going to say very much about Europe unless you're particularly interested in it, but our view has been that in or out, the challenges remain. If we stay in, we are still moving along a path set by government that is going to make life extremely difficult for refugees trying to get into the UK to claim protection. If we're out of the European Union, I see no likelihood that the number of refugees coming to the UK will in any way fall. So we have a series of problems that really can only be resolved regionally by cooperation with our European partners, not just in the European Union, but broader than that, working with international agencies, working globally, but also regionally. Because what we're dealing with, and I hesitate to use words like crisis, but certainly we're dealing with crises, millions of crises, the crises affecting individuals who are driven from their homes, driven from their families, lose loved ones, families being broken up, people forced to take the most dangerous, hazardous journeys in order to get to safety. And then when they get to what they think is safety, their troubles are only beginning in some respects. But let me narrow it down and just talk, based on the experience of the Refugee Council, about the situation in the UK. The UK was one of the drafters of the Refugee Convention back in the late 40s and the early 50s, and we also had a big hand in shaping the European Convention on Human Rights, which together, the Refugee Convention and the European Convention, form the framework of our refugee protection system here. We're a country that is rooted in respect for law. We spend significant amounts of public money on our asylum and refugee system in the decision-making process, long, convoluted, complex decision-making process, in the accommodation we provide for people going through the asylum process right around the country, in the amount of legal aid we spend to provide legal representation for people going through the system, the amount of money we spend on detaining people who come into the country claiming asylum. We treat them like they're criminals, and we lock them up despite they've not committed any crimes, not been convicted of any offences. And for those that are failed by the decision-making system, we spend a lot of money on hearing their appeals, setting up tribunals and all the representation that goes with it. And the system that we have in place, and I deal a lot with the Home Office, I spend a lot of time talking to Home Office officials. There's some good people there. They want to do the right thing. They think they are doing the right thing, which is particularly worrying, given the evidence suggests that they do more damage than good. The system does more damage than good. And critically, the numbers are low. The numbers are coming to the UK seeking asylum are very low compared to many of our European partners. This year, I think the UN and the Home Office suggesting that UK will probably receive somewhere in the order of 37,000 new applications for refugee protection, round about 40% of which will be given some form of leave to stay in the UK. The other 60% will not be granted asylum or other forms of leave and will be expected to leave the UK or will be forced to leave the UK. And it's a system that has checks and balances at every stage of it. We have an independent chief inspector of the Home Office and Borders whose job is to look from an independent perspective on whether the Home Office is adhering to its own policies. We have select committees in Parliament that scrutinise the operation of the asylum system, particularly the Home Affairs Select Committee. We have NGOs like the Refugee Council and many others that hold the government to account on the basis of the information we derive from the experience of the people that we seek to help. We have the UNHCR office in London that is in constant dialogue with the Home Office about the quality of the system and how refugees are treated in the UK. And we have international UN and EU rapporteurs that come into the country and do an inspection, write reports, generally condemn the Home Office for not doing the right thing. So we have these checks and balances in the system. And we have cross-party political consensus. Although you wouldn't know it from looking at that dreadful poster put up by UKIP a week or two ago with a photograph of the long queue of refugees in Europe, even that UKIP supports the fact that we are a signatory of the Refugee Convention and we should be having a system for recognising refugees and providing protection for those that prove that they are in need of refugee protection. And we sustain all that with a narrative which says that the UK has a proud history of providing refugee protection. Well, I'm not so sure we have a proud history of providing protection. I think we have a pretty blemished history of providing protection, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how that is. But given the investment, given the political support, the question is, why do we get it so wrong so often when people's lives are at stake? If we look in particular at decision-making, which is the core of the asylum system, the determination of whether people who apply are interviewed, produce evidence in support of their claim that they have a well-founded fear of persecution if they were returned to their home country. We spend a lot of effort, we spend a lot of money, a lot of heat and light is generated. But there is an abiding and demonstrable poor quality of much decision-making in the asylum system. The officials that we deal with dislike the term culture of disbelief. But this is a system that 30% of those who manage to appeal against a refusal of protection, 30%, 1 in 3, who appeal against a refusal, and they're only the ones who actually get to the appeal stage, get the legal help to put in appeal, 30% have their refusals overturned. If this was the criminal justice system and the courts were getting 30% of the decisions wrong, there would be a national outcry. But as far as asylum seekers and refugees concerned, it goes by without anybody regarding it as evidence of the failure of the system. And the poor quality of decision-making is exacerbated by the poor quality of interpretation provided to people when they are telling their story to the Home Office. Absolutely critical that when you are making an application which can be a life-saving, and you're asking for a life-saving decision on your claim, but you cannot rely on the quality of interpretation if you don't speak English fluently enough for your case to be properly presented to the Home Office. And there is a worrying trend towards the politicisation of the country information that's meant to be objective, that enables the decision maker to cite the individual claim against the context of what we know about the conditions in the country from what we've fled. And an example of that, and a shameful example of that, is the way on Eritrean claims earlier this year the government changed the information provided to its decision makers and started to use a discredited report produced by the Danish government that even the Danish government don't use. They discredit it, which fundamentally says actually Eritrea is a country that pretty respects human rights, and if people are returned there, their rights will be protected. And overnight, after the introduction of that new country information to the decision makers, the grant rate for Eritrean claims dropped from in the high 60s to 34%. The corollary was that the number of successful appeals against refusal shot up to over 80%. So 4 out of 5 appeals made by Eritrean refugees were overturned in the tribunal. So it talks about the politicisation of the system because there was an attempt being made to limit the number of Eritreans coming to the country. And we see that in other nationalities too. And the system, I would suggest, is marked by a consistent lack of respect for individuals and empathy with individuals. It operates to a gatekeeping and not a protection ethos. And I'm afraid that the Home Office gatekeeping imperative sees everything through that prism of border controls and maintaining border controls. And it does that by having developed what I call a self-sustaining narrative that fundamentally most people seeking asylum are in one way or another trying to abuse the system, and it's the job of the decision makers to weed those out. So the presumption when they first come into contact with an applicant is that somehow they're trying to con their way into the UK. Individuals, if you speak to individual decision makers, will resist that, and they'll say, well, no, we do an objective examination of the claim, but we'll look at the results. Look at the outcomes of it. Look at the appeal rate. Look at the successful appeal rate. Something is going fundamentally and systematically wrong. And what are the human consequences of poor decision making? Women seeking protection from gender-based persecution are treated as liars. Trafficking survivors are treated as criminals, rounded up on raids, whether it be on brothels or where there's domestic servitude or cannabis farms. And the people that have been trafficked in and enslaved are very much treated as part of the problem. And before they can get access to a decent lawyer who will advise them about how to protect their interests, they've been charged with criminal offences. Claims on the basis of persecution because of sexual orientation, LGBT claims, are routinely disbelieved. And as with persecution on the basis of religious belief, either regarded as an abusive claim, just con, people are telling a lie, they're just saying they're gay or they're saying they're a Christian because they know that's a way to get a claim upheld. Or if they are believed, they are told, well, you've just got to be discreet. You've got to go back to your home country and be discreet and be private in your behaviour. Then you won't attract persecution. So we're applying UK standards to a determination of how people can or can't be expected to live their lives. And people are routinely convicted for travelling on false documents, for which there is a statutory defence, Article 31 of the Refugee Convention. If travelling on using false documentation, a false passport or a visa, is the only way you can escape persecution and reach a place of safety, then there is a defence in law against the criminal act of entering the UK on the basis of false documentation. But more often than not known by criminal solicitors who say to somebody that they meet for the first time in a police station after they've been picked up and they are travelling on false documentation, well, you're guilty, you might as well plead, and we'll try and get you as light a sentence as we possibly can. And of course, when they emerge from their prison sentence and restart an asylum claim, their credibility is called into question because they're convicted they've been convicted of an offence. And then detention and the use of detention, unlimited detention in many cases, exacerbating the mental and physical health problems that many asylum seekers and refugees face. And perhaps the biggest scandal of all, people who've been failed by the system are then forced to return to their home countries with no monitoring of what happens in those countries, the assumption being out of sight, out of mind. And I've just focused on the decision-making system. If we looked at the reception conditions for people when they first claim don't meet the needs, given that a lot of people are badly traumatised, a lot of the children we see, Refugee Council does a lot of work with separated children. The accommodation we provide to them, whether the fabric or the management of accommodation, completely unsuitable, particularly when we're looking at people whose health vulnerabilities open them up to the dangers of unmanaged accommodation. We saw the stories in the papers a few months ago about asylum seekers in accommodation with red doors or having to wear wristbands that identify them when they go in for their meals. These are ways of identifying these people as others who are only fit for a second-class treatment because they've had the temerity to come to the UK and exercise their legal right to claim asylum. Support levels, the money we give to people to survive while their claims are being determined, lock people into poverty, and not surprisingly, we see high levels of destitution amongst people still having their claims determined, and destitution for people who've gone through the system, and even those who've been given the right to stay in the UK. Destitution is a constant fear and factor in their lives. They're not allowed to work, they can be detained, and then, for those that do get through, satisfy the Home Office, whether at the initial decision-making stage or on appeal, establish themselves as refugees, are given refugee status. They are given 28 days from the day that they receive their biometric residence permit. This is the document that entitles you to stay in the UK for up to 5 years. On the day they receive it, the clock starts ticking and they're given 28 days before their asylum accommodation and their asylum support is terminated. There is no negotiation over this. It is an absolute cut-off at 28 days. And what we see at the Refugee Council, and we have a project team that work on this in London, is people at the end of 28 days just are pushed off a cliff and left to fend for themselves, find their own accommodation, make sure that they apply for the benefits they're entitled, can stabilise their lives in order to move on, get into education, get into employment. The opportunity for doing so is so curtailed and so affected. I wish I could say that the system is going to get better in the short to medium term, but I can't with any confidence. The numbers are increasing. They've been going up. The numbers of people getting to the UK and applying for asylum have been going up steadily over recent years, around about 10 or 15% a year. And yet there is pressure on resources. The Home Office are not allocating extra resources. They're expecting to deal with more people with the same amount, so you can imagine how that plays out in the quality of the response they get from the Home Office. I've talked about the quality of accommodation. No sign that that's really going to improve because the investment is not being made in providing that accommodation. And although we provide legal aid for people to get legal representation, the legal aid system has so failed the provider base that there simply aren't enough decent, high-quality legal representatives out there to make sure that people are given every fair right to make their case in front of the authorities. And I think that those are operational problems, but we're also dealing with some political problems. The Home Secretary last year at the Tory party conference stood up and announced that she would be producing an asylum strategy. We have yet to see it, but we are told the Home Office are working on it, and they've told us there will be no consultation over it. They haven't given us a date for when it will be published. But what we know from the Home Secretary's speech when she announced it, that in essence what it will do is seek to establish a two-tier asylum and refugee system in the UK. The first tier will be for those that they regard as the deserving refugees. And deserving refugees are those that leave their countries because of fear of persecution, move into the next available country, usually the country neighbouring. And if we look at the Syrian experience, it's Turkey, it's Lebanon, it's Jordan, it's Iraq, in the main, Egypt too. And the deserving refugee stops there, applies for a ticket in the refugee resettlement lottery, and just waits. That's a good refugee in the UK government's terms. An undeserving refugee is one that doesn't wait in a refugee camp or in a community in Lebanon where there are no refugees. There are over 1 million refugees in Lebanon, but no refugee camps. They're living precariously on the edge of communities, on the sides of roads, in encampments, informal encampments. And you see that pattern right throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Those are the undeserving refugees, the ones who will not accept that and want to travel independently to protect their families and come to Europe. They are regarded by the Home Secretary in the main as they're the fit ones, they're the able ones. We shouldn't be helping them, we should be only helping the vulnerable ones that are remaining. The fact that those that remain and wait for resettlement, it's a controllable flow then. The government likes the resettlement process. It enables them to turn on or off the tap as and when in response to domestic political imperatives. We're also very worried that the Home Secretary opened up the possibility of redefining the Refugee Convention, the document that is the convention that stood us in good stead since 1951. Certainly the government's view is it's time for a review of it. We need to redefine who is a refugee and who isn't a refugee. And very worryingly, we're hearing the same noises now coming out of the European Commission in Brussels, and attempts are being made to recast our relationship with those refugee-producing countries to persuade them, to bribe them, certainly in the case of Turkey, to pay large sums of money to get the Turkish to be tougher on who they let out of the country, as well as who they let in. And all this happening in a background of austerity in the UK and Europe, where the needs of refugees and asylum seekers are pitted against the needs of people in the host community who are struggling to get housing and who are struggling to get decent standard of living. And so, time-honoured fashion, people are pitched against themselves for scarce resources that are rationed on the basis of political imperatives. It's a depressing situation, and I can't pretend that it isn't. But something happened in the UK last year, something we weren't really expecting, and I suspect many of you here were part of what happened last year. A change in public attitude towards refugees. It had been building for some time as the numbers started to come into Europe the large numbers started to get into Europe, initially across the Mediterranean, but when we managed to close off the sea routes, then we saw the land routes up through the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And rather than being spooked by these large numbers of people coming into Europe, I sense people across Europe, and certainly in the UK, in large numbers, significant numbers, said, no, we understand why these people are fleeing. We've seen what happened after the Arab Spring. We've seen what happened in Syria, what happened in Egypt. We've seen what happened in Libya. Not surprisingly, with the rise of IS, not surprisingly, people are frightened for their safety and are making these journeys. Wouldn't you do it in the same situation? If you put yourselves in their shoes, wouldn't you have made those choices to get on the boat when you were standing at the docks in Tripoli, or when you were standing in Turkey or being about to get on a boat to make that trip to Greece, even though you knew, because you see the news as well, the amount of deaths. For people getting on board unseaworthy, rickety boats, it becomes a rational decision to get on that boat, because staying put isn't an option, and preserving your safety and the integrity of your family. And people expressed that concern. They expressed it directly by going to Lesbos, going to Calais, redefine the whole understanding of what the Calais situation government have been telling us for years. It's a group of economic migrants in Calais that are just desperate to come over here and claim benefits and work for lower than the minimum wage in the UK. People didn't believe that. They could see the suffering, so they filled the backs of transit vans and headed off to Calais themselves. Some went to Lesbos, loads of volunteers in Lesbos, not just the UK, but right across Europe. And in doing so, started to change the terms of the debate. I think the British public got ahead of government last summer, and in 1 week, the first week in September 2015, we had, on the Tuesday of that week, the Prime Minister interviewed on TV, and he said, we are providing large amounts of aid to the region, to the international organisations and to governments in the region. We do not see that there is any need for the UK to take any more Syrian refugees. 2 days after that interview, we saw the publication of the photograph of the dead body of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old who drowned in the Mediterranean. The next day, David Cameron was asked, what's the UK government going to do? And he said, we will be taking thousands of refugees. Now, he didn't do it out of compassion. It was a political decision, a hard-nosed political decision, based on the fact that his advisors in Number 10, but also in the Foreign Office, in the Department for International Development, were saying the public will not wear this. The public want the UK to do more than it's been doing. So the government was forced into action. Took a weekend to plan what it was going to do, and it came out with a commitment to provide resettlement places for 20,000 Syrians over the course of 5 years. Carefully calibrated to be a significant number, but as low as possible. The calibration was that by fixing on that number, we'll buy off this public concern. But it didn't work. It hasn't worked. Within 2 or 3 months, the government was forced into accepting a further 3,000 children at risk from the Middle East and North Africa region. And it's gone on. With the Dubs Amendment, the government was forced to agree to take an unspecified number, as yet unspecified number, of separated unaccompanied children in Europe. It crossed the Rubicon that it said it would never do. It would never take any refugees from mainland Europe. Well, it's broken through that. Why? Because public pressure, expressed through our parliamentary representatives, forced government into change. I think it's because public understand the reasons why people were fleeing and could put themselves in their shoes and make that empathetic assessment of, I'd have done the same, therefore I want them to have the kind of welcome I would want if I was arriving somewhere with or without my family looking for help. The Syrian refugee resettlement programme of 20,000 and the 3,000 children at risk and the unspecified number of unaccompanied children will have to be looked after in local authorities that around the country that have no history of welcoming refugees into their communities. I think this is an opportunity for us. The growing network of organisations, any of you heard of the City of Sanctuary network? Grown exponentially over the last 2 years, now over 100 groups operating in cities and communities around the country. Ordinary people coming together and saying, okay, we don't like what's going on, but we have limited impact, limited influence on Westminster government, but we can change how our town hall behaves, and we can insist on our local authority, our city, being a place of welcome. And we know, because we're supporting some of these Syrian refugees in some unusual places. In Hertfordshire, which I would never see as a prime area for refugee support. Hertfordshire Council wanted to be part of this. Worcestershire wants to be part of it. Shropshire, Herefordshire, right around the country, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, all saying, yes, we want to be welcoming these people. We want to be part of giving these people a new life, a chance of safety and stability, a hope of a future. And I think where before we looked on refugee flows from afar, told by our media and our government, this is not really our responsibility, we do the best we can out of compassion, but it's somebody else's problem, somebody else will resolve it, we can put our fingers in our ears, build higher walls around Fortress Europe and Fortress UK, and just ride this one out, because it'll go away eventually. I think our reading of why people make these hazardous journeys was mediated and increasingly informed by those who are directly informed in humanitarian relief work, whether it was in Calais, whether it is in Lesbos, or whether it's in our localities around the UK. And it's sustained both by the decision of international NGOs, those that work in the field, Save the Children, Oxfam, Christian Aid, a range of those, for the first time, because of the seriousness of the refugee flows in the Middle East and the pressure they're putting on governments there and the pressure that's being felt by the INGOs, they did for the first time something they've never done before, which was start to get involved in UK politics and have a view about what the UK government should be doing in the UK. It brought a different constituency, it brought a different voice to the debate. Similarly, I've described the rapid spread of local groups organising around the country, putting pressure on, Calais, Help Refugees, Citizens UK, Solidarity with Refugees, faith groups, trade unions, universities, businesses, all conveying the same message through their representatives that we could do better than this. We want a country that feels more comfortable about being more open. Look at what happened in Germany, they say. Germany took 1 million people, did it calmly, did it orderly, in an orderly way, and has come through the other side. Of course there's opposition. Of course there's opposition in Germany. Of course there's opposition in the UK. Why would there not be? This is a contentious area. People feel very strongly about it. And there's always going to be opposition. The point is, for the first time in probably 10, 15 years that I've been working in this field, we started to see the public getting engaged in support of a progressive line on refugee protection. But it's not spontaneous. It won't happen without us all committing to be part of that movement of people and public saying we want a different approach. There was a vocal role being played by a broad range of civil society voices that continues to this day, the senior judiciary, faith leaders, celebrities, other opinion formers, but ordinary people too, and by the engagement of mainstream organisations, institutions, and we're in a university today, and I'm very pleased that I've been talking to a number of universities recently, and certainly there are over 30 now that are offering placements for Syrian refugees. We'd like to see that broaden to refugees generally, and we'd certainly like to see them not being treated as overseas students and having to face the prospect of 3 times the tuition fees. What we haven't had in this country is what I would call the visible leadership that we saw in Germany with Angela Merkel, that we saw in Canada with Justin Trudeau, that we saw in the Vatican with the Pope, and closer to home that we've seen in Scotland with Nicola Sturgeon, we've seen in Wales with the devolved government there and with devolved government in Northern Ireland. Visible leadership, saying to their country, their communities, we can do this, we can manage this. This is maybe a challenge in resource terms, but it's one we're up for, and we want it to happen. So, the question, I suppose, is where we go from here. I started off by questioning whether European Union membership was going to make any significant difference, or non-European membership, EU membership is going to make any difference. And I don't think it is. I think it's going to make it, if we're out of the EU, it will make it harder in some respects, because there is no answer to the refugee challenge being presented to us in Europe. There's no answer that doesn't involve collaboration and a regional response. So you can say that if we're out of the EU, that's going to make it more difficult. But we've been in the EU now for 40 years, and it's difficult enough. The UK has opted out, long since opted out of any immigration, home affairs legislation agreed by European Union states, and that obviously affects our immigration policies and controls. We opted out of the common European asylum system directives that set minimum standards for the reception, for the processing of the treatment of refugees. We wouldn't have anything to do with that. And the challenge will be, whether we're in the European Union or out of the European Union, how do we foster an acceptance in our government that collaboration with Europe is the way forward. Unfortunately, we do collaborate with Europe, though. We collaborate with Europe in devising schemes that will make it even harder for refugees to get to Europe. The EU-Turkey deal being a prime example of it, a programme that was nobody ever thought it would work, and it isn't working. But it has brought in to our discourse the notion that the European can do deals with third countries, either countries that hold refugee populations or countries that produce refugee flows. And we can do some pretty murky, squalid deals with them, where effectively we bribe them to strengthen their controls over who leaves their territory, so that people are not even able to get to where they engage with smugglers and make the hazardous journeys. I mentioned that the Home Secretary is committed to producing an asylum strategy that we're expecting in the next few weeks once the referendum is out of the way. So we've started to do some work on what an alternative asylum strategy for the UK looks like. We're not going to go into detail about the process. We're just going to set out some principles. And I just want to finish by outlining those 4 principles underlying what we think is a proper, fair, humanitarian asylum process in the UK. Firstly, we must increase the opportunities and the routes that enable people to get to safety legally. At the moment, you cannot get into Europe, and you certainly can't get into the UK legally by any means if your intention is to claim refugee protection. There is no humanitarian refugee visas on offer, something we think there should be. The French issue them, Brazilians issue them, other countries have started to introduce them, where you would go to a British consul in the country where you're living, might be in Beirut, it might be in Ankara, it might be in Cairo, and say, I'm a refugee, I'm fleeing in fear of my life. And if you satisfy them at a pre-facie assessment of your claim, you will be given a humanitarian visa to travel legally and safely to the country that issues the visa. Let's say it's the UK, and when you arrive in the UK, you make your claim and it is assessed as any other claim would be by the UK. So safe and legal routes for people to reach safety. Humanitarian visas is one, but also being far more flexible and proactive about how we use our refugee family reunification arrangements. Refugees who have been given status have the right to apply to be reunited with their families, some of their families. If, like me, you have a 19-year-old daughter, you would be faced with the appalling dilemma of what you do if you've left her behind, because there's no way you can get her legally to join you in the UK. Family reunification only covers dependents up to the age of 18. If you had other dependents that weren't direct relation, if they weren't your father and mother, if they weren't children under 18, then there's no chance the family reunification policy and procedures will allow for that. So we need more flexibility, because protection is family reunification is a protection need, not an immigration matter, but we treat it very much as an immigration matter in this country. The second principle, not surprisingly, given what I've been saying about the decision-making process, we need to make decisions based on all potentially available information, including that of independent experts, and the decision-makers themselves should be of the highest calibre. It's a shameful truth, but 3 years ago the Home Office reorganised the asylum system, and one of the things it did, it lowered the qualification level required for you to practice as a decision maker. No longer were they designated in Home Office terms as higher executive officers. They decided that no, executive officers will be sufficient. When we challenged that, they said, but the employment market in the UK is such that we're attracting candidates of the same calibre, but for less money, because people are so desperate to work. Not surprisingly, people do take up these jobs. They last for, on average, 9 months before they move on, because the culture within the decision-making process in the UK is pretty toxic at the best of times. And anybody with imagination and who's come into it thinking this is about refugee protection is soon disabused of that notion, and many move on. So there is no stability in the system, which adds to its problems. And everyone within the decision-making process should have access to high-quality, publicly funded legal advice and representation at all stages. Not only because it's the right thing to do to make sure the person gets every opportunity to present their case fairly, but good decision-making makes for a well-functioning system. So it actually would work for the government. They would need to spend less money on the system, and that wouldn't cause them so many problems. But actually there's no appreciation of that, and one might argue that there is an appreciation of it, but a refusal to move down that road, and a system that delivers poor, consistently, systematically produces poor outcomes is actually beneficial, because it acts as a deterrent for many people. The third principle, and I think a pretty key one, is that people need to be treated with dignity throughout the process. I've talked earlier on about leaving people who come into the UK seeking protection, treating them as liars, and the impact that has on them. The way we warehouse people into unsuitable accommodation, the way we force them into impoverishment and destitution. We need to think differently and act differently. Government should ensure that everyone who goes through the asylum process is treated with respect at every stage, even if they have been found not to have a case. They've not been able to substantiate their case for protection and are facing removal. They need to be treated with respect. The removal needs to be humane, and it needs to be mindful of what the impact will be for that person arriving back in the country of origin. We need to end the use of detention in the asylum process, and we need to allow asylum seekers to work when they are able, particularly if they are left more than 6 months waiting for a decision on their claim. And we need to ensure that everyone is entitled and obtains sufficient support to maintain quality of life and access to healthcare. And finally, and it speaks to the issue of those that are granted refugee status in the UK, everyone granted protection should be given appropriate help to rebuild their lives. We've been having a conversation with the Home Office just recently around the whole issue of refugee integration. When the Prime Minister stood up and said we will take 20,000 of the most vulnerable Syrian asylum seekers, that was a high-level political commitment. The Prime Minister is regularly asked in the House of Commons and by the public, how's that commitment doing? How are we doing? How many people have come into the country? What's happened to them? Where are they? So it's a very visible commitment the Prime Minister has made, and not surprisingly, government officials have been charged with the responsibility of making sure that that commitment is met. And they have discovered the only way they can meet that commitment is if they get the agreement of local authorities and they engage those local communities. So, thanks to the Syrian resettlement programme, we have started a conversation now with the Home Office about the need to invest in refugee integration, that enabling people to move on in their lives, to make a contribution to the society in which they are now living, benefits everybody, not just them, but if it benefits the communities. So the Syrian programme has, although it's not enough, it's a first step only, we need to press for a much higher commitment on refugee resettlement. It is also quite a useful way of putting pressure on government by demonstrating that we do refugee resettlement very well in this country. And the evidence of that is to be found in the communities that have established resettlement programmes, Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester, mainly cities in the north, which have been involved in refugee resettlement for over 10 years now and have a brilliant track record on enabling people to move on in their lives, find work, get their kids into education and make a contribution back to the host society. So it's a troubled world we live in, and it's a troubled country we live in that has not yet found a way of discharging its legal and moral responsibilities in a way that is not poisoned by the difficult internal political debates about immigration, that is not able to escape the scapegoating that goes on of migrants and refugees in particular, because that serves a useful domestic political purpose. And the question, I suppose, that I leave hanging out there is, how are we going to change it? Can we change it? I believe we can change it, but it's going to be a fight. And it's a fight that involves us all. There's no sitting on the fence on this. If you're not part of the pressure for change and progressive approach to refugee protection in the UK, I'm afraid you become part of the problem, because you are cited by government as the public, that section of the public that is worried and doesn't want to see more refugees brought into this country. We changed the weather last summer when we were out on September the 12th, and I'm sure many of you were out, whether in London or other parts of the country, saying refugees are welcome here. Well, that message got through, but it still needs to be made. There is another demonstration coming up on September the 19th in advance of two big UN meetings to discuss refugee protection and global refugee response, and we're aiming to mobilise the public to make sure that the message gets through that the UK could do more, should do more, and the British public won't settle for anything less. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to, if we've got time, be happy to take any questions.